an exercise that the Levy Institute has been engaged in for a number of years now, since Minsky and Wynne Godley were at the Institute. And what Wynne Godley did was to create a macroeconometric model using as an operating principle the macroeconomic identity, which I will show you later. So let me start first. Also, I should say that Minsky was very much familiar with that macroeconomic identity and wrote about it. And even though this identity is not a policy or a theory, it informs policy. So let me then start with some background information, what's happening in the current situation in the US. We consider the growth to be anemic. Yesterday or the day before yesterday, there was an announcement that is the final measure of GDP for the second quarter of 2013 at 2.5%, and the previous quarter was 1.1%. The private sector is still indebted and deleveraging. There's a decrease in government expenditure and stable net export demand. And we have an income disparity. I'm sure you've heard of the sort of the demonstrations between 1 to 99% that we have in Wall Street, and I think it has become sort of in many, many cities in the US as well as abroad. That income disparity can be considered to be the result of weaker unions, a regressive taxation, and perhaps the low minimum wage. And finally, we have, as was pointed out in a number of sessions, the shaky financial system. Now, this graph shows the contributions to GDP from the major sort of components that either increasing or decreasing GDP. As you can see that both consumption and private investment have been net reducers of GDP. Financial business corporations seem to be stockpiling cash as opposed to be investing in capital goods. In terms of the employment, which is the other most important issue in the United States, the job creation figures are not very reassuring. We are actually creating jobs that at the rate of which, if we were to include also those new entrants in the labor force, it would probably take 60 to 65 months to reach an appropriate level of full employment, as we define full employment. And that is because we have about 12 million people that are unemployed. So the unemployment rate, the last one we have, is 7.3%, and if we include in addition to the unemployment, the underutilization of labor, that is those who are marginally attached, those who are part-timers for economic reasons, then it goes to 13.7%. And what I will show even later is that the linkage between growth and creation of employment has been weakening in the last 3 decades, and that's a major work that's been done by Basu and Foley. And I will show you how this works later. What we have seen, therefore, is recoveries, but those recoveries are jobless. So in the last sort of unemployment recession, it takes much longer to get back to what we consider to be level employment in comparison with the previous recessions, the 1980s, 2001, and all that. Youth unemployment, you know, is about 25%. So the unemployment picture is not great at all. So I think I went too fast. Okay. So this is the Godley framework, which links the three balances, the private sector, the public sector, and the current account balance. And you'll see how these have changed. from 2008 to the fourth quarter of 2012, and then the second quarter of 2013. You see the shifting of the private sector from 1.1% to then 5.3, and now has begun, as I will show, there's begun some kind of a movement of credit increases. And clearly the public sector has had some shifts as a result of the fiscal stimulus that we had in 2009 and 10, and how it has evolved. Same thing with the current account balance. In terms of the graphical representation since 2000, you can see how, 2005, you can see how this has evolved. If the trend were, if I had to have more historical perspective here, as Randy pointed out, in the 1990s, we would see that the private sector balance would be really, really in deficit. And towards the end of the Clinton administration, the public sector would have been in surplus. Again, some more background information. You see how the disposable debt, debt-to-disposable income in households has been sort of evolved. You can see you run up to 2007, and then it began to deleverage. Similarly, but not as precipitously, is the non-financial corporation debt-to-GDP ratio. Now, the approach to simulation is that we use some conditional projections, which first we use what the official values for the growth path of exogenous variables are, such as the government expenditure and the revenues, the world output and world inflation, and monetary policy. And then we make some further assumptions about variables that affect private expenditure, such as the capital gains and the changes in the equity markets, as well as the housing markets. Simulation results are first, we take our model computes the amount of borrowing required by the private sector for the economy to track the CBO, which is the Congressional Budget Office, projected growth path of output. So this is usually our, what we call a baseline scenario, which I will show in a few minutes. So we use the model to derive the growth path of output and unemployment under more reasonable assumptions about borrowing. And third, we evaluate the effects of fiscal, monetary, and exchange rate policies on more reasonable scenarios. And I will show why we think that we use more reasonable assumptions as opposed to those that are employed by the CBO. So the baseline scenario is basically then uses the CBO forecasts. And the CBO forecasts show that the government deficit will fall rapidly through 2018. Government spending will decline until 2014 and then begin to stabilize. Government revenues will increase to 2015 and then stabilize. And we make the further assumption to adopt the latest IMF growth projections in the rest of the world, especially those of the US's trading partners. So in graphical representation, you can see how the red line, the deficit, has been increasing from 2013, which is it's assumed to be 5.3 by the end of 2013, all the way to 2016, reaching 3.8% on the basis of the revenues and expenditures assumed in the CBO projections. These are the tables, the table that shows how they will evolve over the sort of years of the simulation period. Now the assumptions we make about the world growth rates, both in terms of historical perspective in 2011 and then to 2000 and the end of this year, are taken from the IMF. And you can see that they're separating the emerging markets, the entire world, and then the advanced economies, which include Japan and Europe. We make some projections, just focus on the dark line. We've just some projections about the household debt to disposable income. And you see there are three other lines, color lines, and those are the other three scenarios which I will talk a bit later. In the same vein, there is the corporation's debt to GDP ratio. And you can see the assumption is that they will begin to actually borrow heavier than we believe they will. So, in terms of the three balances that the macroeconomic identity gives us, you can see that indeed we get what the CBO suggests, but we don't assume that the borrowing will actually turn out to be exactly what the CBO suggests. So, in summary, these are the baseline results. There will be a gradual decrease in the private sector surplus from the present 3.2%. I saw 5.4, but that was actually the last quarter. So now it has decreased to 3.2%. And to go down to 2%, which seems to be implausible because it never happened before, with the exception of the Goldilocks, which I don't think that it will happen again. At least I would hope it doesn't happen again, otherwise we'll have another, perhaps, meltdown. The ratio of the household debt to income falls only gradually, and the ratio of the non-financial corporation debt to GDP ratio also rises smartly. So the model verifies, with the assumption of the 1.4% growth in 2013, that the unemployment rate will increase from the present 7.3% to 8%, as the CBO suggests, but that the government will begin to drop and that will reach exactly what the CBO suggests, 3.8%, and that the current account deficit will be decreasing from 2.9% to 2% by 2016. Now, we believe that the projections of CBO are based on a faulty structure of their model, and that is because their model is based on supply-side economics, and that the assumption is that the economy will grow at potential output because the usual neoclassical assumption that government will get out of the way, it will crowd out, they won't crowd out private investment. That has never been proven mostly, so the assumption then of the CBO may be actually faulty, as we will show. So because of what we think that they're implausible results, we move to a scenario one, which we make some slight changes in the assumption. First of all, the scenario one is following the Federal Reserve's sort of wishes that had been expressed by some of the members of the Federal Reserve System, whether they're presidents of Federal Reserve banks or even governors, that they will continue this quantitative easing until very, very recently they've changed their tune, until the unemployment rate reaches 6.5%. So we make the assumption that what will it take to get to an unemployment rate of 6.5% within 2 years. The assumptions we make then is that there will be a smaller increase in taxes on wages and salaries, that is assuming the CBO, that the interest rates will continue to be stable and low, and that there will be an increase in real government purchases, as indicated, which are higher than what the CBO, the baseline scenario, which the CBO scenario assumes. And the results, of course, show that there are more pessimistic projections about the government deficit, which is natural since there will be more expenditures for the government, but that the GDP growth rate will increase to 5% in 2015, and then it will stabilize at a higher rate than the baseline, but that the unemployment rate will be reached at a 6.5%. And if you look in terms of the graphical representation, this is really what the results look like. Beyond the vertical dark line is the projected balances and also the GDP growth rate, which is a heavy black line measured on the right-hand axis as opposed to the other balances that they are measured on the left-hand axis. Now we actually have seen that there are other people who have been talking about an unemployment rate much more acceptable than even the 6.5%, that of a 5.5%. This was talked about by Christina Romer, who was the former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under Obama in the first term. Paul Krugman, and also Robert Reich. So we thought what would be the exercise if we were to move to try to find what we would need to do in terms of the government fiscal policy to reach a 5.5% unemployment by the end of 2015. So the only difference, of course, between the assumptions of the scenario number 1 and this scenario is that the government outlay increases by 11% per year for at least 2 years, 2013, 2014. And clearly the results again show that the government deficit will increase naturally, 7.3% throughout, which is higher than in scenario 1, and of course very much higher than baseline scenario. GDP grows to a high rate of 6.5% in 2015, and then stabilizes below 5% thereafter. That is for 1 more year, since this simulation period goes to the end 2016. And the unemployment rate, which was a target, is reached 5.5% at the end of next year or the beginning of 2015. And the private sector debt to GDP ratio is lower than the previous scenarios, baseline and 1. So these are the graphical representations of, again, the 3 balances and the growth rate of this scenario. Now, of course, these are scenarios that I think they're wishful thinking, because given what's happening in Washington, I don't know if you're following, but apparently the stock market went wild today because there's no progress in Washington, that in fact United States government will go bankrupt since they will not be able to erase the debt ceiling, and so on and so forth. So those 2 scenarios don't seem to be that plausible. And therefore, we go through another exercise in scenario 3, which we assume that there's an aggregate demand growth in all sectors, that is not only in the public sector, but also in the private sector, including both households as well as the non-financial corporations. As well as also, there seems to be some movement of some faster growth in the world than those that are assumed by the IMF. So we make the assumption that growth will increase by 1% higher than the previous scenarios. And therefore, that will result in some increases in the net exports from the United States. Also, although we don't make this quantitative assumption, but qualitatively, that there will be some reforms of the corporate taxation to encourage the onshoring process. Those of you probably will be following the United States. There was a major sort of attempt through the writings of Alan Blinder and none other than Larry Summers, who suggested that the United States should actually eliminate all taxes for profits that will be brought from abroad to the United States, provided that these profits are used to create employment. Now, of course, this is very easy to say, but if you look even in terms of quantitative analysis, what Mr. Blinder suggested is that $1 trillion be brought back to the United States. And if you make some crude calculations about using all this $1 trillion to create employment, you actually need to import people from Germany because we don't have enough unemployed people to employ them all. So again, that's an idea which I think sounds very good, but it's not necessarily very plausible. But anyway, there is some movement to have some changes, although I would say there's a movement only in terms of verbal statements, but no actions, since we see what's happening in Washington in terms of the United States not being able to pay its obligations, since Congress believes that this is the way to teach the administration a lesson. So we assume that there will be some expenditure, but also some expenditure from the other sectors. And the government expenditure, we want to focus actually on infrastructure, which is decaying. It's been suggested that we have over $1.2 trillion of infrastructure deficit. This has come from reports from the Civil Corps of Engineers. Felix Rohatyn and other people have been talking about this. You know, it's interesting when you discuss going sort of to Shanghai and getting off the airport, the plane, and go through the airport of Shanghai, and then you take the train to go to town, as opposed to going to sort of land in JFK, and then from JFK you want to go to Manhattan. And the different ways of going, you wonder which of the two is the developing nation. Is it China or is it the United States? So this scenario also, as I said, indicates that there will be some growth, which means that from all sectors, that means that there will be some borrowing. And indications show that the consumer credit has been increasing. This graph goes to the end of 2012, but even if you look at by June 2013, or even July 2013, there is a continuing increase of the consumer credit. So not a lot, but there is some increase. So it's a plausible assumption to make that it's possible for that to increase even further. Now, there's an interesting relationship which relates actually to the research and development, and that is the relationship of the manufacturing sector with the trade deficit and the current account balance. And you'll see that even though there are certain various troughs, but the trends are actually the same. They are downward. And one can say that the United States can export primarily high technology goods. Of course, we also export financial services. I'm not sure those are useful, but nevertheless, we can see the deindustrialization of America, and that has something to do in terms of how much we invest in what actually needs for high technology to grow, and that is research and development. The next chart shows you where we are. It doesn't necessarily show that we're doing badly, but if you were to compare it with other nations, such as South Korea and Germany and Japan, let alone China, we are lagging behind. We consider that to be some kind of a good assumption to make. Now, this chart shows you the exports, U.S. exports by country of destination. And this is again until the third quarter of 2012. And you can see that Asia and the Pacific are really where something's happening, as well as Europe and Canada. Latin America also, although at the last count, it seems to be some decline in U.S. exports to that region. And Africa seems to be relatively stable. In terms of the trade-weighted U.S. dollar exchange rate, there's a relative some stability here, although there is a decline in with the uptrend of the dollar and the changes in the Chinese currencies. With that, what are the results of scenario 3? Well, the private sector balance reaches 2.6%, which is more plausible than the 2% that the CBO is assuming. The government deficit is not as low as it's in the baseline scenario, but it's not as high as in scenario 1 or scenario 2. And the current account balance reaches a 2.6% deficit by the end of 2016. And the GDP growth is the sort of healthy 5%. And I will show you that, again, the unemployment rate decreases, and it's actually much closer to scenario number 3, that is closer to the 5.5%. So these are, again, in graphical representation, the balance, the 3 balances, and the growth rate. Again, I want to underscore that these are not forecasts, but orders of magnitude. These are not really that some particular time this is what is going to be met. Even though Wingalli was warned us to make that statement, sometimes we sound like Federal Reserve, that we say we have nothing, these are our personal sort of views and don't represent the Federal Reserve System. But I think Wingalli's record for forecasting has been quite good. We seem to be following those footsteps of Wingalli. But still, I don't want to say that they're forecasts, but they're orders of magnitude. So a comparison of the unemployment rates between sort of the 2005 and in terms of the actual up to 2013, and what is projected to 2016, which is the end of the simulation period. And you can see the difference between the baseline scenario, which is the dark black line, to scenario number 3 and 2. In 2015, you'll see that they are closer to 5.5%. But that again assumes that the government will play its role along the Minskian lines of a big government. So now the next thing I want to show you is what I said earlier in terms of the relationship between output growth and what's the effect of output growth on unemployment. And you can see that what this chart, what stable represents, is that how much employment in recovery periods grows, how much employment will grow due to 1% of GDP growth. And you can see that from the 0.714, which was in the 3 decades ago, or was 4 decades ago, all the way drops down to the baseline standard of being to 0.258. So Occam's law has changed dramatically. And you can see the results of all the scenarios, how they have changed. So we need a lot of support and a lot of fiscal stimulus in order to reach a level of unemployment that one might begin to consider that it is equal to full employment. Now, another sort of sector which has always been a driver of growth in the United States has been the housing market. And this is what it's shown, where we are in terms of the housing units, the permits, and the statistics that will tell us something about where we are with the housing sector. And of course, you can see where sort of the levels of very, very low in comparison to the period that it is shown here. So let me just then conclude to say that certainly we cannot afford to have more austerity. I think that we have seen what has happened in Europe. We're seeing that we have a stubbornly high unemployment in the United States. And that through these sort of scenarios, a very small sort of fiscal stimulus, especially at the end of the scenario 3 with the private sector, could actually deliver the goods that and the targets in unemployment that we wish to have. Now, there are, of course, other suggestions that could make unemployment much, much lower, and that's something that Jan has referred to it in his talk about what Minsky had in his mind in terms of the employment of last resort. And that has been sort of talked about. Someone has talked about it. Robert Rice has talked about. But I don't think this is a fertile ground for the United States. It may happen elsewhere, but not in the United States. So let me end here and thank you, and I'll take your questions. Yes.
That's pretty interesting. But I was caught by your statement that this is not very realistic if we continue to have warfare in Washington. And so there's no crisis prediction scenario, it seems, that what would happen if government expenditure at the federal level doesn't go up, but rather actually as a share of GDP that there becomes more stable. In other words, if we sequester becomes more severe, or if the congressional gridlock prevents spending going even in useful directions. I mean, as that we just say, just throw up our hands, and how bad could it be?
It's a very good question. The Levy Institute with this sort of exercise has been known to be the Cassandra of all the think tanks, so I didn't want to scare you. But if the sequester is to continue, we're looking for unemployment that reaches back to 9% in 2 years' time. We don't believe this will happen. I think that some changes will take place in terms of some incentives for corporations to invest. There's some movement on onshoring, although it's not clear that that would mean higher employment, because as you know, and we talked about it, I think informally at dinner last night, about the robotic implementation of work, the change of the factory. But my view is that we will be looking to some really terrible results if indeed that continues. I don't think it will continue, so I would suggest that it's probably between the scenario 3 and the baseline scenario. This is where we would fall in. Yes.
I see that in basically all the scenarios, the current account balance in the U.S. is getting somewhat better by the end of it. And I don't know, I was looking at this data, and the impression I have is that exports have been growing more, imports have been growing more than exports since the recovery started, now in the past year. And the only reason that the current account has been stable is that factor income payments have decreased a lot due to the low interest rates, mainly, on treasury bills and bonds. So I don't know if I believe that, given that, okay, if the Fed doesn't change the policy, this may continue to be so, and I guess that's what the scenarios are capturing. I'm not sure. But if not, then this may, we may be back to a higher current account deficit. Isn't that reasonable?
Well, as you will see, in terms of the actual, the current account balance has been decreasing, right? And that is the result of, right, and that still continues. So it shouldn't actually surprise you that it will stay. If you look on the monthly data, you'll see there's a relatively stable deficit.
But because the trade balance has been deteriorating, what's now stabilizing it is the income factor part of it, which is becoming very surplus. I mean, which I'm not sure it's staying.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that we would expect to have any different for the next at least 3 years. Remember, this is a simulation period up to 2016, so it's not a long-term global imbalance. I'm told that I'm over, so thank you very much. I think we move